Okay, let's try again. Thanks, Leah. So like I was saying, I'm very excited to introduce a new team member to the NNIP headquarters staff. Elizabeth Burton is here joining us, and I will let her say a little bit about herself.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to meet you. My name's Elizabeth. I just joined Metro this past week at the Urban Institute, and I recently graduated from McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I'm excited to work with you all. Thank you.
Her thesis was about the Tulsa Race Massacre, and I got to read it, and I'm very excited that she's joining us. I think she'll contribute a lot to our team. And of course, you know, the typical fellows, Kathy, Leah, I, and Alex. So next, I'll throw it over to Leah to talk a little bit about our upcoming racial equity work this fall.
Sure. As you all know, we've been convening partners around the topic of racial equity over the last several years. And we recently developed a series of goals to improve use of data in advancing racial equity, to really try to put some meat behind some of our ideas and concerns about how we're using data. We previewed those with partners during NNIP month and got some great feedback, along with the executive committee in June. And we think these goals are going to help offer a framework for aspirations for people to improve their data practice and organizational strategy around racial equity and justice. So we're aiming to send the revised goals to the full partnership at the end of the month, and then continue this work with a series of webinars. The first would be more of a high level, and we'd have two partners reflect on how they are working on the goals at their organization, with some discussion, and then try to do a deep dive into one of the goals at a time. So it might be like specifically on methodology or different reframing indicators or something like that, but to make sure we're having more focused discussion to lift up examples, share practices of how people are doing this work across the country, and discuss challenges people are having. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, who's going to talk about other ways we'll be engaging you all this fall.
Second, there we go. We didn't have a chance to pretty this up, but we wanted to give you a sense of planning, and we'll be sending out a summary note to the Google group. I see a few new names on the participant list, so definitely we'll connect with you to make sure that you're on all these channels of communication. We've been checking in with our friends in New Orleans, from New Orleans, Allison Plyer and Denise, about the census data, which is coming out in less than a month. If the redistricting data sort of came up upon us quickly after waiting so long, how we are going to describe this new differentially private data to regular people is still, I think, a big question for all of us. And there's no answers. I have tried to email everyone I know who works on these issues, and everyone's giving kind of a big, shoulder shrug about guidance. So I think we are the best experts about knowing your audiences, and from church basements up to the mayor's office. So I'm gonna just pull together a brainstorming session. I'll have some framing slides, but it'll mainly be, I think, discussion and just talking about how we're going to be tackling the redistricting data. So this is more about communications of the data, although we're happy to convene another conversation or start a discussion on the listserv if there's some more logistic, like ETL kind of questions about the data too. Bob, you'll hear later today, but we expect there'll be an affordable housing work group session to follow up from his presentation. Early September will be our general office hours. And we also want to, maybe this is, Leah and I personally wanted, and hope that this will be helpful for all of you, to just have a little reflection on the last year and a half and how our organizations have changed during COVID. What are good things that happen that we're going to keep? What are things that we're trying to phase out that became habits or necessities during the time when we were virtual, but sort of thinking ahead about what the implications were, more big picture about engaging with data during the pandemic over the past 18 months, and what we can learn going forward. So and then on the, we also, thanks to the Baltimore folks and Laura and some other folks attended, talking about technology, more about the data sort of storage, processing, access, and it became clear that we are out of date in knowing what technology partners are using and what technology questions and decisions they need to make in the near future. So are planning a survey in September. We'll have another office hours and showcase in October, if you, and then November, it is the 25th anniversary of NNIP. We'll be figuring out some peer activities, but we have exciting news that Linda Hamilton, the president of the NEEKC Foundation, and Angela Glover Blackwell, who is the founder of PolicyLink and one of the very early NNIP partners from Oakland, have agreed to be on a panel with our Urban Institute president, Sarah Wortel, moderating on the community use of data and equity. So we're hoping that we intend for that to be more of a external Urban Institute hosted panel that will be publicized to general audiences, not just internal. So we're happy to hear these are what we have in store, but we know other things will come up over the next 2 or 3 months, and are happy to hear other ideas of if you want to grab informal call or organize something on a topic that you care about. And I'm going to turn over the next slide. Oh, that's Sonia on the topic of today's call.
Perfect. Thank you, Kathy and Leah. So if you read some of the notes before the call today, we're going to be discussing affordable housing supply. So before we get started and bring on our great panelists, we wanted to just lift up that there is a lot of work going on in this subject across the network. And this slide is by no means comprehensive at all, but we just wanted to lift up some of the work that is going on, and perhaps it could inform a little bit of the conversation in the future, especially because today we'll talk a little bit about market supply and also subsidized housing supply. But there's a million ways that we could talk about housing. I think evictions has been a popular topic that we've discussed, and that has been really coming to prominence during the pandemic. So there's a lot to explore here, and if you don't see your work up here, we'd love to showcase it in the future in either showcases or websites. So really briefly, Charlotte has been tracking the stock of single family homes owned by large scale landlords, and I think increasingly that is something that we need to be mindful of. Second is Chicago has been analyzing the loss of patterns for 2 to 4 unit housing stock and their impact on overall affordable housing supply. Dallas participated in the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation COVID-19 recovery grants, which if you've been watching some of our Medium posts is affiliated with that work. And they worked with Texas Tenants Union to better understand tenants' experiences with eviction remediation and protection programs, including programs specific to the pandemic. New York is running and recently launched the Housing Solutions Lab with a former Urban Institute colleague, and they're helping small and mid-sized cities launch and evaluate evidence-based local housing. So it's a little bit more of technical assistance to get and translate some of this knowledge from data to action. And then lastly, Memphis, one of our newest partners, has been working for a few years on their property hub with data on residential properties. And they have also layered it with things like enforcement violations, construction permits, ownership, and tax delinquencies. So like I said, we just wanted to lift up that there's a lot of work going on this particular subject in the network, and that this conversation is ongoing. So next, what we're all here today for, we have three great panelists who will be presenting on the subject. First, we'll have John from DataWorks NC go first. Then we'll have Luis from the Kinder Institute. Welcome also, Luis. I think you're newer to the network. I don't know if this is your first event, but we're excited to hear you present. And then of course, we'll have Bob talk a little bit about both the Pittsburgh work, but also ideas for cross-partner engagement on the subject. So I'm going to stop sharing screen, and John, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Sonia, and thanks everybody else too. I am going to start this presentation and share it. Thanks for taking some time and for making space for me here. I am going to, everybody sees this okay? Cool,
Yes.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna hit start on a little timer too and try to stay tightly timed for the sake of the flow of things. So, John Killeen, I'm in Durham, North Carolina. What I'll talk about right now is work that really is derived from community partnerships we've had for years now. In the last year and a half, building on a long trajectory of work for community groups alongside of in partnership with. The last year we've had some interesting scenarios where real estate development issues have come up. The title of this, Affordable Housing is Not Affordable, is sort of rhetorical, obviously, but it's also just a reference to the fact that the landscape of methods that we use to determine what's affordable have come to track development away from homes being made for poor and low wealth people and more toward middle income households. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. And it just points to, I think, one of the most problematic cracks that everything falls through right now, which is the fact that we have like woefully and desperately underfunded public housing. And then this very, very vibrant push to develop more affordable housing, which is not really addressing the needs of poor people too, and certainly not handling the needs of people being displaced currently. So it's a little bit around the frame of why I called it that. Again, all the data that I'll talk about here are really derived from work that we've done directly with Bragtown Community Association and the Walltown Community Association here in Durham to currently predominantly Black neighborhoods, historically Black neighborhoods with deep histories and family legacies and heritage that are still in place on site. We work with those folks directly in answering their questions for their work. And so some of this was actually presented to the Planning Commission last year, about a year ago now, and led to some interesting changes in the way we talk about planning locally. And I'd be glad to share a link to that recorded Planning Commission session in the chat afterward too, for folks that might want to take too long to look at what that Planning Commission looked like, but where this data really lived too in public space. So briefly, the information that we rely on a lot is sales information. So this is, the raw inputs here are really sales of residential properties of all kinds, but actually they're still filtered here for single family and duplex sales, and much of which is new construction. And what we did in this particular, these couple of slides we'll look at right now, is look at the last 20 years plus of property sales, specifically for the Bragtown area. And this map GIF was really just to reference the fact that the surrounding areas of Durham have rapidly gone from relatively affordable from a regional perspective to incredibly unaffordable to people who've long lived here. And you can see that in those red dots, which are sales over $200,000, which in some national markets seems low, but we've quickly leapfrogged over what national levels of affordability would have been in Durham during this period of time. And a lot of the new construction in Bragtown particularly has just jumped right in that. And it's a community with much lower household income and a large proportion of renter occupancy, many folks who would like to have more stable housing. So to the point of more homes not meeting more affordable homes, this is obviously a common narrative that we hear everywhere. It seems to be a pervasive trope of the language of supply and demand, which does not exactly really replicate what we see borne out in data or in community lives. So what you see here is that we use the same dwelling unit counts that were tied to the property sales, that these are prepared by the planning department. And from 2010 until 2018, in 2010, there were 4,429 homes in the community. In 2018, there were 5,062, so it's an increase of 633 homes. There was nearly 70% of the homes would have been affordable to people who currently lived in Bragtown in 2010, but by 2018, the sales that were happening were 41% or so affordable to people living in the community itself. So we used the median household income of people in Bragtown to look at whether or not home sales would have been affordable to people living there. And so this is kind of a point to the fact that geography really matters for median income. The median household income for Bragtown is $32,373. The area median income, which includes Durham and Chapel Hill, is certainly much more than that. And what the sort of 2/3 of Bragtown families currently rent their homes as well, like I mentioned. So gauging affordable market rate housing using regional data, particularly in this case, dismisses Bragtown families that may want to become homeowners and participate in one of the processes that we hold high for creating family wealth in this country. And this is another example of how we did the same thing for Walltown and how it's borne out in really more detail. The median household income for the area is nearly $91,000, and Walltown similarly is roughly 1/3 of that. So you can see in this particular case what that would mean for affordable rents in greater detail. This reliance on the area median income when it's metropolitan like this, the HUD information that says like what are the standards of 30, 60, 80% area median income, really are driving, I think, a lot of what I'm talking about when I say affordable is not affordable, because in cases like where LIHTC projects, low income housing tax credit projects, will really rely on 80% or 60% to be able to finance what they need for their returns to make it a viable project, are going to be derived from the AMI, and they're used to defend the budgets too for those projects. And the fact of the matter is that there's a dead end happening here with community members who are saying our community is being overlooked in this, and the numbers do not help and they're irrelevant for us actually. And here are examples. Tell us how you can get to rents that are in the $200, $300, $400, $500 range, which is somewhere between public subsidized housing, which the average rent for people in Durham Housing Authority properties is $220 or so. The gap between that and $600, $800, $900 is where we're trying to find new housing being built, and it's not happening. And some structural causes for that exist. So costlier homes also equal costlier taxes and the threat of displacement. In 2019, the median rate of tax value change for residents in Bragtown was double what the county average was. But in 2020, half of the homeowners in Bragtown had been trying to pay 50% increases. And as of April of the year, last year, there were 8.5% of the tax arrears in the county existed in Bragtown because of their inability to pay for it in a lot of cases. So this is just to say here as well that housing alone isn't the topic. Housing plus exploitative wages does not equal affordable housing. And so if we're not going to talk about the other side of this equation, which is the fact that people's income has not increased in a lot of cases, particularly the folks we care about making homes affordable to, it's not happening. So 56% of the area's residents in Bragtown work in these particular sectors. This is a chart that shows the sort of distribution, the hierarchy of wages for people in healthcare and social assistance. And much of the time, the people that we're trying to do this work for, all of us in aggregate, are folks doing these jobs that are care economy jobs, nursing, senior care, family care, child care, and so on. And their wages, inflation adjusted, have decreased in the last 20 years. So some key ideas, and this is just framing from us, and it comes out of our work here in Durham. I'm just going to submit it for y'all's consideration. That number one, housing has become increasingly commodified. Sonia's already referred to that in the context of Charlotte. We're all thinking about how this has happened over the last 12, 15 years especially, but it's always been going on. So as a commodity, no commodity exists in nature except as the exploitation of a basic resource for profit. So there is no naturally occurring affordable housing. just as there is no naturally occurring affordable education or affordable healthcare. And there's an important, perhaps entertaining, but I think incisive small print to consider here. Fourth, income standards of affordability are problematic once aggregated to a geography large enough to mask segregation. We have, all of us, I think, landscapes that are unequal based on class and race. And to use a regional or even a county area median income is to mask the wild fluctuations in what communities experience and what their assets are. Another thing is that we always like to keep centered some of the wisdom of the Los Angeles Tenants Union, and just simply up front too, housing is not in crisis, it's people that are in crisis. Housing doesn't need crisis counselors or lawyers, it's people, right? And then people, Black, Indigenous, people of color, poor people especially, really truly need protection in this economy, because that's what's happening. People are harmed by the housing market, harmed by a lot of the other surrounding structures of our community and our society. And something like affordable housing really truly should be a fail-safe for them, and something that as a right provides them the basic ability to exist healthfully in America. So those are my slides, and I'll be glad to step back at this moment. And Sonia, do you prefer that we keep moving through slides and then come to Q&A and that kind of thing afterward, or how do you want to structure?
I was thinking afterward, but if people have like pressing questions, we're actually doing, I think, okay on time.
Okay.
So feel free
I lost
to...
track of them too, so.
You're good. But this was great. Can you stop sharing for a screen?
Gladly.
Yeah, thank you. That was excellent. So yeah, to John's point, if you have like really pressing questions that you'd like to share right now, I was particularly struck by, I think, how naturalized a lot of these processes become through our definition of what affordable housing is, through, especially in that last slide, the type of language that perpetuates our usage of data that allows for things to kind of continue becoming less and less equitable. So I think it's a kind of great call to action about matching our framing and our language to the data that we're collecting. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed that presentation. Luis, it's your turn. So if you'd like to share screen. And like I said, I'm seeing in the chat that people really liked that last slide. So if we want to talk a little bit more about that after all the presenters have gone, we can do that too. Luis, floor is yours.
Great, thanks everyone. Also echo the language on Noah, John. All right, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so we are, let's see here. Okay, sorry. So I'm gonna kind of breeze through several of our different projects. We are working on a housing preservation report that's going to be published in the fall, but I don't have all of the hard data and mapping yet to show. I have a couple of sneak peeks. So I also took the opportunity to bring in some data and information that we've done this year that I think is prescient to the topic of housing supply. Some things that kind of surprised us, but I think some of the things that we're looking into as we go into the housing preservation, a report that I think is going to get into more of the housing stock around quote unquote NOAA, as people call NOAA, and some of the publicly assisted housing here in Houston. Kinder is also leading the Harris County 10-year housing study, which will inform a 10-year action plan by the county to address affordability needs. And that's the first ever plan in the history by the county government here in the Houston area. I'm going to cover first retaking stock, which is a look at redevelopment and changes in the housing stock related to gentrification typologies and things that we've done in the past. We overlaid some findings around that, around demolitions and building permits and the housing types. And then I'll cover a couple slides also on our annual update on state of housing, which has some data here that I think is relevant. So the one thing you'll see in the retaking stock that I would that I think was kind of interesting is we broke up the Harris County region into 3 geographies. Like one is this predominant, what we call the inner loop in Houston. If you're familiar with Houston, this is the most urban core part of the city. It's the darker gray. It surrounds downtown and a lot of the urban neighborhoods around the core. Then we have the second sub area, which we're calling the inner loop to the Beltway. This Highway 8 is the Beltway here in Houston. And then beyond that, you have much more of your typical low density suburban neighborhoods, most dominantly now around the Grand Parkway, which is the third major loop around Houston that is in construction around the region. And what I think struck us here, what you see in this table on the right is we divided up, this is in the appendix, but there's some really interesting numbers around the kinds of housing types that are emerging within each sub area. And what really struck us was this growth of particularly multifamily, but a lot of what we're calling detached townhomes. They're actually small they're single family lots, but they're under 5,000 square feet in size. Houston revised its land use ordinances at the end of the 90s and permitted this housing type by right, where they reduced the lot size down to, I believe, up to 1,400 square feet if certain performance measures were met around open space. And most of them are around somewhere between 1,400 and 3,400 square feet lots. And that's created a housing type that has really become very prominent. 17,000 of them were built in the inner loop of Houston between 2005 and 2018. And they're not as common further out just because the land economics are not, land is not as costly. So this is being used a lot to subdivide some of the urban single family neighborhoods. Another thing that kind of surprised us was just where demolitions were occurring in the county, or just in the area in general. So the map on the left shows the higher income areas in blue. Again, for those of you that are familiar with Houston, this area on the left is known as the Arrow. There's a lot of, there's some Twitter threads around this and all kinds of interesting maps that people have done around Houston's Arrow. It's a area of higher wealth. You can see also in the suburbs, you see some of that, but it's in the urban part of town. That's where it's occurring. And we found that a lot of the demolitions were occurring there too. And a lot of redevelopment activity was happening there, which in a way might be a positive thing for some of the urban neighborhoods in the city that are facing gentrification pressure. The fact that there's high demand areas that are seeing the kind of growth that they're commanding, or the kind of turnover. When we looked at this housing type, specifically this detached townhome, which to most of the appraisers is known as single family, we thought it was kind of a dishonest exercise to label these as single family just because they're not the conventional single family house. They, as you can see here in this image, they sit literally a couple feet away from each other. And in Houston's vernacular, they're very much well thought of as a townhome. And so we thought, well, let's go ahead and just, like, for the purposes of this report, let's classify them as such. And so we looked at several neighborhoods, 7 neighborhoods overall in town. And what we found is that a lot of this is this housing growth is occurring in a lot of these high demand areas, which you see in the map in yellow, orange color, which are areas that gentrified in the 90s or before. But this housing has been constructed there since the 2000s. And we're not seeing as much of it in the gentrifying areas or in areas that are vulnerable to gentrification. We're seeing lower amounts of that. And again, it likely is staving off higher, what we consider to be higher potential gentrification and displacement. So just to give you a quick example, I'll just draw your attention to the report. We did some neighborhood analysis like this, where we looked at the kind of changes in the housing stock. On the left, what you see is just the overall housing types in a neighborhood like Third Ward, which is close to downtown. And you see this townhome really clustered around other areas that have had a lot of redevelopment, like Midtown and Museum Park. But then some troubling patterns here too, in a neighborhood that is seeing a lot of demolitions, and some of the demolition here in red on the other map is really kind of foreshadowing where you might see a lot of this other townhome growth. So there's kind of this double narrative, I think, of this housing stock. It's in one way, it's happening in high demand areas, maybe keeping away more rampant gentrification, but at the same time, it's a very real risk and threat in neighborhoods as you're starting to see a lot of demolitions kind of foreshadow where that's going to happen in lower income neighborhoods. So these are just some, we looked at some of the demographics as well, and we've noticed that there has been slight changes, but not as drastic as we might have imagined. There was a drop in the African-American population from 80% to 65%, which for the type of growth we're seeing of this housing stock, over 51% of the new housing built has been townhomes. It hasn't been as drastic as one might have thought, but this is some just observational type of research that we did. We want to do more inferential statistics around testing some things out and seeing what might be some of the actual correlations and cause and effect here around Houston's land use codes. I'm going to kind of try to breeze through this very fast now. In the state of housing, we're seeing two different realities emerging, one for owners, one for renters. This is very typical of what's occurring in markets throughout, in cities throughout the nation. What you see in the orange these are gaps in the affordability gap between what a renter can afford to buy in a home based on their median household income, which is this cost right here, and the actual cost of the median sales price of a home in the county, which is at around the 230 something range, 230 something range now. So the gap is at 94,000. But what I want to highlight here is that when we did this analysis, looking back at 2010, the gap was only 30,000, and we've seen in the last decade the gap triple, which is an alarming sign for us. Renters are cost burden. We see about 51% now in 2019, the cost burden, and that's grown significantly too. So that's just renters are having a difficulty overall, mostly concentrated at the income, at the under 35,000 income range, which is about 60% AMI in Harris County. So it's really concentrated at under 60% is where the biggest shares of cost burdens are. But the one startling thing that really alarmed us was when we looked at the latest, at those census numbers from 18 to 19, there was a precipitous increase in overcrowding of the rental housing stock. It went up somewhere like 22% from 18 to 19. That was the biggest jump we've had in the last 10 years from year to year. And leading into the pandemic, right? And we know that we know that urban density wasn't the largest contributor to COVID. It's in fact a lot of overcrowding in our housing stock and multiple generations who are having to work living there. And so the map to us when we did it looked very similar to what we had seen on the Houston COVID positivity rate map. And that really alarmed us. So there's more we want to do here, but it was just kind of an initial reaction that just kind of blew us away. And you see in the darker blue that Southwest Houston, north central parts and southeast parts are areas where a lot of that overcrowding really picked up prior to the pandemic. So real effects, the affordability challenges are leading to real consequential effects here, as we can see. And just some suburbanization of poverty issues that we're seeing. A lot of our housing loss, both evictions and foreclosures, are really occurring much further out from the urban communities where a lot of our social service agencies are and our community development organizations are. And so the problem here spatially is becoming a lot more challenging to tackle. As you can see, evictions here are really clustered beyond that beltway or hugging the beltway area, which is that second loop. So these are all a bunch of mostly inner suburban areas. Now onto the housing preservation report, we're going to do a lot more data around this, but just to give you a sense, the housing type that people refer to as NOAA, we just recently ran some numbers here, and in the county about 315,000 housing units exist at this that are considered quote unquote to be NOAA. That's about 19% of all of our housing units. So we have a pretty substantial stock that's out there. It's been built. It was built in the 70s and 80s. It's really in bad shape and has had a lot of challenges with the winter storm Uri that went on, and constant, these kind of compounding damages with major flooding and hurricanes that we've had over the years. So that's some numbers there on that. We have our subsidized housing stock. It's kind of a drop in the bucket. It's 3% of all the housing units, but we are also going to be updating some data on that for the report. And then just tying this back to the spatial aspect, which is what we're starting to get into now in this report. It's What you see on the right is the map of the federally assisted housing stock, that 3% of housing stock. It's really, none of it is really in the arrow. It's very little, like there's just no data in there. It's mostly all in this, what we call this like backward C, or this crescent that I'm trying to point at here. It occurs in areas that are a lot lower income. That's where we've seen that housing has continued to be segregated there, at least the public subsidy side of things. And then our NOAA mirrors very closely a lot of some of the other maps on evictions, but it's a lot of these areas in Southwest Houston and in inner kind of suburban parts of the Northwest Harris County, which again, you can start to see some of the differences here. But again, the final report will have a lot more data about this. These are just some sneak peeks I wanted to share to the group. We're going to be doing some best practices from some of Charlotte's efforts around NOAA housing funds, looking at resident-owned communities for manufactured home, as a viable way to provide affordability opportunities, and then some of the local efforts that have been going on with some CDCs on social impact funds to help to actually start doing and taking over NOAA properties. So there's some things we want to spotlight there that are happening, but that need more attention and funding. So I think that's all that I have. That might have been a little bit longer than expected, but here's my email in case anyone wants to reach out. I'm happy to share more background on the work we're doing.
Awesome. Thank you, Luis. If you want, you can put your email in the chat as well.
Sure. Yeah, we'll do.
And stop sharing for a second so I can see everyone's faces. But I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm from Houston, and it was not surprising, but really great to see some of the overlay of these trends. I think it was particularly salient to see how our Black legacy communities are being affected by drop in affordable housing and also overcrowding, and also how the areas where a lot of immigrant populations, particularly Spanish-speaking Latinx immigrants, reside in, especially in the area of overcrowding. So I think that it has a pretty strong racial equity lens attached to all of the trends that you're seeing. So it was really great to have you bring that out. And with that, I'll let Bob come to the floor as well. He'll be talking a little bit about how we can bring this work and partner across our different cities. And I'm really excited to hear about that. So go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sharing my screen. Give me a second. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Come on. Is it coming up there? Okay. So I'm just going to back up to the beginning here. Okay, so I just want to talk about, like, let's work together and see what we could do. So I know there are a lot of great projects, and these have inspired us. So Core Data in New York City, Housing Insights in DC. And what we wanted to do was kind of replicate that. At the point when we saw those tools hit the market, our Urban Redevelopment Authority was doing stuff like this in an Access database. They were printing PDFs for people, but it wasn't publicly available. There was a guy whose job it was to link this stuff, and he was not, he was working in spreadsheets and kind of doing a good job with what he had. But again, it wasn't publicly accessible, and they wanted to make more of this stuff available for planning and use, but this is where we came in. So just like one of the things that we looked at was the National Preservation Database, but it's not licensed for public use. And rather than go down that path and find out that the rules have changed and the data is only updated 3 times a year, I thought, well, it'd be better to pay our staff to do that. And so David Walker is on the call with us as well. So he's here. I don't know if many of you met him, but David just said hi. So he's been doing a lot of work on the data end of this, which is a lot more complicated than we thought. So what we're doing is using support from 2 foundations, partnering with the Carnegie Mellon Create Lab, and trying to build a sustainable data infrastructure to support preservation, development, market research, displacements. You can read the rest of that slide. We want to create information tools like those in DC and New York City. And then we want to do a lot of technical assistance and data literacy around this data too. And so we started, like all of our projects do, probably all across the network, just with really messy spreadsheets, trying to make sense of what all this data is, looking at what New York and DC were using, looking at what was in the preservation database, where did it come from? Can we track it back to the source and the table and the actual field? And so we did all that. And our data model looks really simple here, but it's not that simple because, there is no main project database in HUD. You have to create a project database across properties that might have multiple funding streams and different IDs for different funding streams. The data landscape at HUD is a real mess. You have things that are posted as access tables, as Excel downloads, and as open data. So that's something, I guess. But what David was able to do was pull in data feeds of all this data that update it all every day. So you can see I just pulled a screenshot. It's running. It's there as open data. We haven't made it public. We're still kind of linking things together, creating common IDs across projects and properties. And then, the tool that we're building is going to look a lot like this. We did a lot of engagement sessions with different community members to kind of figure out, and it's going to look a lot like what people want to do, like look at subsidy expiration dates, see where things are on a map, create alerts when something might fail their inspections or come close to that. And so you could see, like, nothing that we haven't all seen before on these calls, so I'm not going to get into the details. But this is where it gets, I think, a little bit more interesting, is like, how do we work together to figure out the data model for all of this data? And so Peter Tachian in DC has been really helpful in talking to us about this. Like, how do we handle what people consider a project, but it's multiple phases of funding, different funding sources, could be in scattered sites or different locations with multiple buildings. And so how do we make sense of it all? Because a lot of it just doesn't make sense. And then how do we actually use this data to think about the NOAA, or naturally occurring properties without a subsidy? So, like, should we be doing things like looking at multi-unit buildings and more affordable markets, sticking into the data model, so if there's like some kind of an issue there where maybe there's a code enforcement issue, condition issue, a fire, can we create alerts for that? And then, like, how do we define those is another question. Like I mentioned, talking in circles here, communities that have higher affordability, the properties that are multi-units in there, but also, like, can we work with our partners at the county Department of Human Services, where we might be able to share some of the properties that maybe some of their clients that are in income restricted programs might live in, so we can start to create, a little bit more scaffolding around notifications and alerts. And then how do we use this data? Like, there's an opportunity, and Peter's talked about this, like working with the National Housing Trust and all the experts to just figure out what it all means. What do we keep track of? What dates matter? We've learned a lot, but there's a lot we just don't know. We're all trying to figure it out on our own, I think. And, how do we want to work together for this? Can we write a playbook? Can we even provide feedback to improve federal data practices so that they're not putting things up the way they're putting it up that makes it really hard to consume it, undocumented data, all that stuff. And then I think another thing that's really interesting conversation is, like, we build a lot of tools all across the network, but do we do enough thinking about how we bring that data to people where they happen to be talking and meeting? And so, like, we did an ecosystem app and, have visited these tables to develop the strategy, but, like, how do we go back once this thing is ready? And I know in DC, there's the preservation working group. We sat in on a meeting, saw how they do it. And how do we kind of bring those tools and make use of it in those meetings all across the network? Those are questions we'd love to explore. And so, just like maybe ideas in chat, just how do we work together? So that's it. Any comments?
Yes, I was about to say, I'm sure people have comments on on this, so I invite people to share ideas. Maybe we can start reactions before we get to ideas, if that's too intimidating, but just general reactions about the presentation, at least, and how maybe you're seeing some of that work play out in your city.
And if we can lobby to be Batman.
you know, I was trying to get everybody in there, but my computer was like getting really slow and I didn't want to crash it. So I had to stop.
We have a question from Sarah asking, can you talk a little bit more about the data that is missing or available from the sources that you're pulling?
Yeah, David helped me out, but I think like it's a lot of just like learning. Like there's a lot of local data. We're, you know, trying to get data out of, you know, our city affordable housing fund, or eventually will. I think that's too much to handle right now. You know, Federal Home Loan Bank has data that we're trying to get, but a lot of it is just like trying to make sense of it all, because there's so much of it and so many different tables that we don't know what we don't know. You know, like for example, I don't know if there's data for LIHTC properties. Like I think the state level agencies are supposed to inspect that, but I don't know if that data exists. We've talked to ours, they gave us a cut of their data, but we still didn't get an answer to that question. So like, I think like, we don't know what we don't know, but I think some of you know what we're missing. We might know what some of you aren't thinking about. So it would be nice to really like start to work together a little more closely. I just don't know what would be more convenient for you. Like calls every 6 months, 6 weeks, you know, I'd just love to know.
By the way, Bob, could you stop sharing screen for a second? As much as I love the Super Friends graphic. Thank you. I just like seeing everyone.
I think this, I have a question for John, and this is related to who the actors are, Bob, and who the like decision, who the audiences are. But John, what's the Durham? Are there homeownership programs in Durham that are focusing on sort of the lower income levels, or are they mostly trying to hit that moderate income piece, or are there, you know, tax relief programs for senior homeowners, or what's the portfolio of housing help?
Yeah, I can speak to some of that. There is specifically now in the last few years been a resurgence in the tax support side of that too. So in one, there's a statewide program, the circuit breaker program, which people who are eligible by age and income can apply for. There's always been sort of like a, I don't know exactly what to call it, but like the tax administration has always been sort of responsive to people who appeal and make their case, and it can adjust the rates accordingly. You know, that's been successful for people who can appeal and like take the energy and time and know how to do that.
Yeah.
Even, and then, so that's not really exactly a program, but there has been from the city and the county, like neighborhood specific, they've had to call them grant programs so as not to get in trouble and things like that. And that they've not been very well marketed. And there's been a strong push in the last year or two to really expand that tax credit for low-income homeowners, especially ones that have been in place for a long time.
Yeah.
Developing that criteria, extending it countywide. That hasn't exactly happened yet. And there have been some, you know, iterations toward making that work better. And it ended up being like a deferral, like a 10-year deferral on payments. And like with the hope and belief that sometime between now and 10 years from now, they'll change the rules so that there's not like a bullet payment at the end of 10 years. So there's things like that happening that are aimed more specifically at low income, long time homeowners. And that's where a lot of the energy has been. And then some also about repairs and maintenance for those same folks as well, to keep them from being pushed out for that reason, or getting code violations that turn into liens and so on. But I don't, hopefully that's a direct answer.
Yeah, no, I know it's like at the margins, but it's, if there are resources set aside, the fact that, you know, can they be used as well as they, to the fullest extent possible.
And if I might just add too, like in the last couple of revaluations, there is like an extraordinary black box that the revals happen in, and the tax administration tries their best to explain a little bit of it, but keeps a lot close too. And even after, you know, sort of interrogation at the public level of how the prior revaluations happened a few years ago, the last round had even worse sort of racial impacts. So, you know, algorithms, you know, are going to help us.
Hi, y'all. I'm calling in from my new position at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And it's great to see y'all and hear about your work. We do not do neighborhood level data work, which is the void that y'all fill, but we do have national and state level data, and we can do specific splices if folks are interested, I think at smaller geographies. But we do a report called Out of Reach and a report called The Gap. And we do have like city level geographies, but the whole point is that housing is out of reach for most people because wages don't keep up. Basically, John Killeen's presentation on a state and national level. But in my previous life at Urban, we would use the actually NLHC's data in like data walks to kind of say, here's what's happening at the national level, here's what's happening at the state level, and here's what's happening at your neighborhood or at your city level. So we actually used hyper-local neighborhood level data in conjunction with some of these data. And so I would encourage you to take a look. We just updated it. So it has 2015 to 2019 ACS data, our Out of Reach and Gap reports. And also we have a state partner network. So those folks are working at the state level, but again, I think they're housing advocates that are always eager for data partnerships. So I'll post a link also to those state level organizations. Some of them also work in cities, but when I'm thinking of like creative partnerships, I think that those groups could really benefit from some data folks.
Good to wear your alumni hat, Olivia. Bonus points. Have other people gone through the same like data journey that Bob has? I know we have in the past with DC in the early 2000s, and I think the data structures haven't changed since then much. Others. We forgot to run a poll, Bob, to
Oh, yeah.
know to get a sense, but we could
Yeah, I mean, we could do that. I was just thinking, like, would you be interested in doing a convening? Like, I don't know what the options would be, but like even just like throw ideas in the chat of what would work. I don't know. Would it make sense to do like a workshop session? Because I don't want it to be like we just sit around and talk about the same thing in a circle all the time. I'd like to make it so that we could focus on like, okay, maybe this meeting we're going to focus on documentation, and let's all just like do something and take an action around that, and like try to fill in what these fields mean, or at least what we think what they mean, so we can all have that shared pool of documentation. Like that's kind of what I'm thinking about would be useful.
So maybe there's a brainstorm, like we could do a Google Doc about specific topics, like how exactly is everyone calculating NOAA, or
yeah, I think that would be
alternative names.
With alternative names, and we can also crowdsource all the things you should call it that aren't NOAA. And then, I mean, there could be one specifically on like some of the work you've done, Bob, or how you set up automatic updates from the HUD data. I'm curious about what that looks like. And
David's here. David's here.
I know.
He's done that. Yeah.
Thank you, David. But I think if we got to this very more granular level, then people who are interested in those specific topics can join.
Yeah, that would be good. I think if we unpack that and maybe think of some activities around it, like questions we have right now are just like, how do we use this data? Like, what are the catalysts? Is it like the 15-year time frame for some properties like that we really want to pay attention to? Like, it's so good.
The answer is yes, you do need to pay attention to those time frames.
But we shouldn't have to bug Peter every time.
Yeah.
Every one of us does one of these things.
I know. I had some beautiful picture of subsidized housing documentation. What was that? I could go dig that up. I bet, again, I don't think it's probably changed.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like we pull enough together. Let's like talk to people at HUD and say like, Can you do
Yeah.
this with us?
Yeah, I mean, we have friends and HUD now that we could, you know, maneuver our way to the data people, and there are channels to chime in on suggesting improvements. Not that anything happens overnight in the federal government, but they love to hear about people using their data.
If all else fails, we'll just start putting messages in our windows at Urban, which is right across from HUD.
I know, they don't know.
Cases.
When you come to visit, you'll see that we are right next to HUD, and we can communicate, yes, through big signs with our HUD colleagues. Yeah, or small area rent pieces or things like that, yeah. I think a Google Doc sounds like a great next step. And then we can kind of, people can like +1 it, or if there's links, Bob, to different pieces.
Yeah, I think like if we pick out topics too, like related to this stuff, like every month, every however often people really want to do this, and have a different leader, kind of like just peer learning within the network with virtual tools.
Yeah, I'm wondering, did we document any of this stuff in a property guide that never got published?
It's possible. I don't know about the subsidized data. I don't remember that being in there. But I think the other thing that we could suggest is, if there aren't experts within the network, are there sort of specialists that we could call in from, whether it's NHC or others, or Olivia, to like do like a presentation briefing for us on a specific topic. So that could also be on the Google Doc. Like, I was just thinking about the small area standards. I know that we have folks at Urban working on that, and I don't know any of the latest, but maybe somebody could share that with us.
Yeah. Good.
Okay, so I know we're a little bit over time, but I think this was a great discussion, and I really like the idea of breaking up the playbook potential production into little workshop pieces. So I'm sure we will be in touch regarding that, whatever form it looks like. Thank you so much for coming. We had great presenters. Thank you for offering your thoughts. You know how to reach them. Also, we really encourage peer sharing. The idea for this conversation is to, get a little organized, so we don't have to bug people like Peter, like Bob was saying, but also feel free to reach out individually to each of the partners. And thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks, guys, for presenting.
Great to see everyone.
Thank you.